Hello everyone, this is Brian Lucien, and this is officially the first episode of the new podcast that I'm starting, Film Related Podcast, which I've decided to entitle Heavenly Pictures, in reference to Peter Jackson's film Heavenly Creatures. As I mentioned yesterday in the short video I posted, I started a page years ago on Facebook called Heavenly Pictures. And in it, I was posting film reviews, so this is sort of an extension of that. There's no need or no particular reason to actually call it that. I just decided to do so just to give it a name, just to make it official. Sorry here, I don't like the framing here. I'm going to adjust this a little bit. It's my mistake. There, that should be better. All right. So yeah, so this is it. This is the first one. Yes, I am wearing clothes. I contacted Facebook and I contacted YouTube, and they told me that I couldn't be naked. So I'm sorry, everyone, but I have to wear clothes. And it's going to disappoint a lot of people out there, but that's the way it is. Facebook doesn't like nudity, and neither does YouTube apparently. So I'm going to have to do this with clothes on. And no, the first episode is not about the Lord of the Rings. You see it playing in the background. I just wanted you guys to have something to look at and a little bit of music in the background. So I'm just going to have the DVD menu playing part of the time. I don't think I'm going to have problems with this in terms of copyright, because I'm not playing entire sections of the film. It's just very brief snippets here and there. So I don't think this should be a problem. But we'll see. Hopefully, I'm hoping for the best, that this is not a problem. As I mentioned yesterday, the first episode is going to be an introductory show. This inaugural show is just about introducing to you guys, well, a little bit about myself, but mostly not so much myself personally, but myself in terms of the development of my cinephilia and where it comes from, going back to the roots of it, all the way back, I should say, to my childhood, and all the way to today. To a point, and I'm not going to go that far until I'm not going to go quite until today's movies and everything, but you can hear me talk about modern films as well. So today I've selected a few films. I told you yesterday this is not scripted, but I did choose a few films here, which I decided I'm going to talk about because they're part of my journey as a cinephile. They're part of what helped me develop my love for cinema. Going all the way back to the first one that I'm going to present to you, all the way to the last one, which is a favorite of mine. So, as you know, as I mentioned yesterday, for those who watched the video, this podcast is going to be me every single week choosing one single film out of my film collection, my physical media film collection, DVDs, Blu-rays, 4Ks, mostly composed of Blu-rays, but a little bit of the other two as well. And every single week I'm going to pick one film, and I'm going to discuss that film, sometimes at length, sometimes maybe not. I don't have any plan for how long each episode will be. It depends how much I have to say. So, so it's going to be that. I'm going to pick one film each week, and I'm going to discuss, or each episode, I'm hoping to do this once a week. And I'm going to discuss that film as in depth as I feel like doing so. Sometimes in depth, sometimes not. And every film that I'm going to be picking are personal favorites of mine. Doesn't mean that they're great masterpieces or among the greatest films ever made. Sometimes they're probably even going to be crappy films in there, but crappy films that I, for whatever personal reason, happen to like. So, yes, that is going to be the plan. Except, like I said, today is the inaugural show, and I'm doing an introduction. So I'm going to jump in and start presenting you some of my favorite films. I wanted to give a shout out to the people who, yesterday when I posted the first video, I mentioned Heavenly Pictures, the page that I have on Facebook, and I asked people if they wanted to follow the page. And suddenly I woke up this morning and I had 32 new followers, so I want to thank you all for that. Kind of surprising because I get a new follower once every 6 months. So suddenly waking up this morning and discovering I had 32 new followers, I was quite surprised by that. So I don't know if it's a complete coincidence or not, but the fact that it had 32 new views was actually a nice surprise. If it is a coincidence, well, it's a well-placed one, because obviously I was speaking about it just yesterday. So I want to thank everyone who decided to follow the page, and this will be posted all over Facebook, not just on that particular page, but it's nice that people decide to follow the page as well. So thank you for that. And I want to give a few shout-outs here before I start, because yesterday was the birthday of Ben Worley, sometimes known by the name Thomas Howard. So happy birthday, Ben. And at the same time, it was the anniversary of Anthony and his wife Allison, Anthony Francis and his wife Allison, I believe 2 days ago on Monday. So happy anniversary to you guys. And I'll be pointing out another anniversary when I get to the appropriate moment of this podcast. So I'll get to that when I get there as well. And beyond that, I just wanted to mention that normally I would be doing these videos in higher resolution. As you can see, I'm shooting in 720p rather than full HD or 4K. The reason for this is I actually recorded an episode earlier today. I did this whole episode earlier today in 4K, and when trying to upload it to YouTube, it wouldn't work. I think the memory was too big, or the file was actually too big to upload to YouTube at 83 megs. It was just too big. Maybe it's a problem with my phone, because I looked it up, and apparently YouTube, you can post videos up to 256 megs, but for whatever reason it didn't want to do it, so I decided to downscale the video quality for this particular episode, because this is going to be a long one. The next ones are probably not going to ever reach more than half an hour, hopefully. So maybe the next ones I can do in higher resolution, because the memory will, the file will be smaller. But this one I'm doing in this resolution because of that, because I had problems earlier. So here we go. I'm going to jump into telling you a little bit about my love for film, and I think I should start with the very first movie that I remember. So I'm starting off with this one. It's a very important one for me. Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, it's important to understand, this movie came out, it's important to me for numerous reasons. The first one being, it is the first film I have an image of in my head now. I'm going to show you the inside the box. By the way, once in a while I will be, usually I'm going to be talking about the movies, but once in a while I might talk about the editions I own, because I'm relating this entire podcast to my personal film collection. So once in a while I might be highlighting a special edition that I have, something if I think it's a beautiful edition. But generally speaking, I'll just be talking about the movies themselves. So here I'm going to show you the interior just for one reason. It's this particular image here, the one on, well, it's on my right. And this particular image is obviously very, very famous. It's one of the most iconic images in film history of Elliot and E.T. himself flying across the moon on Elliot's bicycle, a gigantic moon. It is one of the most iconic images in film history, and one of the most legendary, really. And the reason it's important to me is because it is the very first image I have in my mind of any film. I'm not saying it's the first film I ever saw. E.T. came out in the summer of 1982. I was born myself in April 1980, so I was about 2 years old, a little over 2 years old when this came out. I don't assume that my parents, who were still together at the time, I believe, because I believe they divorced when I was 3, but I might be mistaken there. Great motorcycle outside. Yeah, so they divorced when I believe I was 3, but I might have been 2 years old. Somewhere between the moment I was 2 and 3, they divorced anyway. And I don't think they would have taken me to see this at the theater. I'm not quite sure what the first film I ever saw in theater was, but it is the first film I have an image of. I'm sure they showed me movies at home, Disney movies, The Jungle Book or whatever, Peter Pan, whatever Disney movies had come out during those times. I would have seen them as a child, as a toddler, really. But the first film that I have an image of in my head that I can think back and think that's the oldest image I have of a film is Elliot and E.T. flying across the moon on the bicycle. And not only is it my first film image, but it is one of the very first memories I have, period, whether related to cinema or not. So I thought it was important that I should highlight this particular film because, in a way, it might have begun my journey towards cinephilia. I don't consider that I was a cinephile at the age of 2 years old. That's not what I'm saying. And I will talk about how I became a cinephile, but it certainly immediately was an image that had an impact on me. I never forgot the image, is what I'm saying. So it's important because of that. And because it's a Steven Spielberg movie, I thought I should jump into what is actually my favorite Steven Spielberg film. Over time, I've come to love this one more actually than E.T., even though E.T. is also one of my favorite films ever. I'm not saying one of the best, but it is a masterpiece. But this one here, Jaws, obviously 1975, the movie that started the summer blockbuster, so to speak. And it's an important film, mainly because it's my favorite Steven Spielberg movie, and it is one of my 10 favorite films of all time, still to this day. I didn't really need to highlight it today, but I figured if I'm going to mention E.T., I should at least mention my favorite Steven Spielberg movie, which is this one. So I don't really have much to say about it right now. It's obviously iconic, legendary scenes in here, but I'll do a whole podcast on this movie at some point, so I don't need to get into details. I'm sure I'll do one on E.T. as well at some point, but I don't need to get into too much detail here of how much this film means to me. It's going to be discussed when I do the podcast about this particular film, so for now, just know this is my favorite Steven Spielberg movie and one of my 10 favorite films of all time. Now, it's important to understand my parents divorced when I was 2 or 3. My dad met another woman, I believe I was 4. And at the time that my parents divorced, my mom was already in a relationship with another man who moved in with us when I was about 4 years old, and eventually we moved to another apartment in another city with this man who introduced me a little bit more to music. Music eventually became a big part of my life, and I'll talk a little bit about that, not too much. But music was an important thing for me for a long time. And there is a film that actually started that love of music for me. And I think I should pay homage to it. It's not a film that I consider one of my favorites these days, but it is a film that changed my life in many ways, and it is this one, Luis Valdez, La Bamba. Now, La Bamba is not a film that I consider one of the great films. It's not a masterpiece. It is, apparently, I didn't know this, but a fellow Facebook friend called Jeffrey Wang told me when this movie was announced as a Criterion release, I remember dismissing it and saying that it didn't seem like the sort of film that was worthy of being in the Criterion collection. And he pointed out to me that it was apparently very instrumental in the development of Chicano cinema, and that Luis Valdez was apparently an icon of Mexican cinema and stuff like that, which is something that I didn't know. In fact, I didn't even know the name of the director until very recently. It's just a movie that I'd seen many times, but as a kid, and a few times as a teenager, but I'd never bothered with who the director was. So I just thought I should mention it because this is the movie, when I saw it, came out in 87, I would have been around 7 years old. I don't think I saw it in theaters, but my parents, my mom would have rented it at some point, probably in 88 when it came out on VHS. And it would have it impacted me because it's the movie, when I saw this movie, I wanted to play the guitar. Suddenly, it made me want to play the guitar. And it took a few years before I got one of my own, but my mom's boyfriend, Marc had a guitar. He wasn't a guitar player himself, but he had a guitar. He strummed a few chords and stuff. It was this acoustic guitar with nylon strings. I remember it well. I even have a picture of it somewhere with myself holding it at 4 years old. But I didn't know much about the guitar. He didn't teach me anything. No one did, even though I had uncles who played the guitar. Both on my dad's side, I had 2 uncles, and on my mom's side, I had 2, maybe 3 uncles who also played. And but they didn't teach me anything. But one day, I was 8 years old. It was after this movie, after I had seen this movie. My mom by then had bought the soundtrack. She used to subscribe to the Columbia, what was it called, Columbia House or whatever. They used to release cassettes and distribute them to your home for low prices, and she had bought a few cassettes that were soundtracks from movies. I remember Stand By Me was one of them, and one of them was La Bamba, the movie soundtrack, which at the time I did not realize was not the real Richie Valens. I didn't understand that this was Los Lobos who were covering the songs. But Richie Valens became my first music idol, not knowing that I wasn't listening to Richie Valens actually. Eventually she bought me a cassette also of the real Richie Valens, and I thought his versions were inferior to the ones seen in the film and performed by Los Lobos. So one day I was listening to the tape, the cassette of the soundtrack, listening to La Bamba itself, the song La Bamba, and my mom was there, and I was just playing with my mom's boyfriend's guitar, who was probably at work or something. He wasn't around, and I started figuring it out. I figured out the intro. I didn't know this at the time, but now I know I had perfect pitch, and at the time I did not know that I had this capability, this true gift actually with my ear, of being able to almost reproduce anything I heard and know exactly how to. So I picked up the guitar and I started playing, and I figured out the introduction. I don't know how long it took me. It probably took me hours, but in my mind it took 5 minutes, but it's probably not the case. But I figured out the introduction of the song and I started playing it, and then I figured out the chords. They're pretty simple. You know, it's just C, F, and G, so they're pretty simple chords. I figured them out as best as I could. I probably couldn't play an F chord because it's a barred chord, but I figured out a form of it, maybe. And suddenly I started playing it, and my brain understood the mechanics of playing guitar for some reason. I don't know why. I'll never understand it myself. But and then I showed it to my mom, and she was flabbergasted. Her jaw dropped that I could do that. No one had ever taught me, and this was the movie that started that. And it wouldn't have been possible, or it wouldn't have been implemented in my brain if I had not seen this movie. And a couple years later, when I was 11, they actually bought me my first guitar. And I started taking guitar courses when my mom, she left this guy, Marc. She left Marc when I was 11 years old, and we moved to Chateauguay. I was living in the next town over called Mercy at the time. And when we moved to Chateauguay, I started getting guitar lessons with a guy, I forget his name now, taught me for about 3 years. And I got my first guitar. She bought my guitar on my 11th birthday, just before she left Marc. She left Marc, I remember, in the summer of '91, so just a few months after I got my guitar. And that, but this movie started for me. If it wasn't for this, I would never play guitar, and I've played guitar almost ever since. I broke my wrist in November 2022. And since then I haven't played anymore, but up until then I had played quite regularly. Sometimes I had periods where I didn't play, but I'd always kept up with it. Even when I was having moments where I wasn't playing, I would always come back to it. And this is the first time I've had such a long period of not playing, and I don't know if I'll ever get back to it. My wrist never recovered, but the point is that the guitar became the most important part of my life for about 10 years until cinephilia became the big thing for me, and I'll get to that soon. So La Bamba, very important film for me on a personal level, not so much cinematically, but at least I don't understand much about Chicano cinema, so I don't know how influential it has been, but it has been for me. The next thing I want to present is this entire set is not important to me. It includes a whole bunch of Batman films and a whole bunch of Superman movies. The original 4 Christopher Reeve Superman movies are included in this set, and it also has the Brandon Routh Superman Returns, which much maligned, but I actually think it's a pretty good movie. And it also includes what I call the original 4 Batman movies, even though they had made some in the 60s with Adam West, but the original 4, meaning the 2 with Michael Keaton, directed by Tim Burton, and the 2 directed by Joel Schumacher with Val Kilmer and George Clooney in the titular role of Batman. Now, not all these movies are important to me, only one of them is. A lot of people consider Superman a seminal movie for them. Anthony Francis would certainly tell me it's seminal for him, and sorry to say that it wasn't for me, but the one that is important, I'm going to take out the disc here just to show you the one movie, is Tim Burton's Batman Returns. Now, Batman Returns is, I wouldn't call it a masterpiece, but it is my very favorite superhero or comic book movie ever made. It is certainly my favorite Batman movie. I'm still in awe of the work done by both Danny DeVito as the Penguin and especially Michelle Pfeiffer as as Catwoman, and also Christopher Walken as Max Schreck, which I'll come back to a little bit later, the character of Max Schreck, because he's linked to another film that I'm going to present soon. But it's an important film because when I started developing as a cinephile in my 20s, I rewatched that movie. I had seen it. I saw it in 1992. My dad, his wife, took myself and my sister to see this movie in theaters, and when it came out in the summer of 92, and obviously it disappointed a lot of people. It was not the movie that anyone expected. It was darker, it was violent, it was somewhat grotesque. Some people even thought it was vulgar. And I believe that's how everyone in my house felt. My dad's wife and my sister certainly felt that way. And I've never been quite sure how my dad thinks of it. But me, myself, I liked it. I probably didn't say it at the time. I wasn't very good at expressing my own opinions when they were contradictory to those of others, so I probably wouldn't have said it. But I loved the movie when I first saw it. And, 10, 12, whatever years later, when I was doing my journey into cinephilia, I'm going to turn down this a little bit. And when I was doing my journey into cinephilia and really developing as a cinephile on my own, I rewatched this movie at some point, which I had seen it numerous times over the last 10, 12 years, but I rewatched it and realized something that I didn't realize up until then, which was it's a blockbuster movie in the sense that it's a Batman movie, so obviously its intention was to be a blockbuster. It was, a commercial movie, even though it didn't end up doing as well as the first movie, and it disappointed some people, and disappointed at the box office a little bit compared to the first one. And by the way, shout out to Dan Waters, who's on my Facebook friend list, and he is the screenwriter of this film, one of the screenwriters of this film. And shout out to you, Dan, because you actually wrote my favorite Batman movie and my favorite comic book movie, so thank you for that. But getting back to it, thought I should mention that what happened with this movie is it made me realize that it was possible to make a blockbuster or a commercial endeavor in cinema that was also altruistic. This is clearly a case where this is the work of a very personal filmmaker. Batman had a little bit of that, the original one by Tim Burton with Jack Nicholson, and I'll talk about Jack Nicholson soon. But this one it's 100% a Tim Burton movie. Everything about it, from the opening shot and the opening music, all the way to the last moment, and the poetry of it and the pathos of it, it's all entirely pure Tim Burton. And I'm still to this day in awe of the fact that someone managed to make, especially in 1992, a commercial film, blockbuster type of movie, whether it was as successful as intended or not, that turned out to be an actual cinéma d'auteur, as we would say in French. It was altruistic, and it was personal cinema, personal filmmaking, and he managed to blend those two things together, a blockbuster and personal altruistic cinema, into something that I think is quite beautiful and one of the most poetically mesmerizing films, certainly in that genre, that I've ever seen. So Christopher Nolan managed to do something similar when he did Batman Begins in 2005, but he had done it first. And I'm not saying there hadn't been commercial endeavors done before, or blockbusters which hadn't been also very personal and author-driven. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a good example of that. 2001: A Space Odyssey is, for all intents and purposes, it was a big success. It didn't it divided the critics, but it did well at the box office, very well at the box office for that type of film. And yet it was very much a non-commercial approach to cinema. It's a very intellectual film, so it managed to blend those two things together as well. But that's only sort of accidental. A film like that normally wouldn't become a blockbuster. It just happened to become a very popular film. Whereas, Batman Returns was intended to be a blockbuster. So it's surprising that a film intended to be a blockbuster managed to also be a very personal endeavor for the filmmaker. Next, the film itself is not that important for me. It is actually quite important in the history of cinema. But for me personally, the film is ordinary, but I think it's not ordinary. I think it's a beautiful film, but it's not a masterpiece or anything. But it is one of the most, it is one of my favorite films, I should say. So even if I don't consider it a masterpiece, it is a favorite. And it's important because of who it stars. It stars the Beatles. Everyone who knows me knows how big a fan of the Beatles I am. The Beatles are the most important aspect of my life, artistically. More even than The Lord of the Rings, which you're hearing now and seeing a little bit of, and more even than cinema in general. The Beatles have been the biggest single influence on my life outside of the people that I personally know. So I can't I can't pass up the opportunity to talk a little bit about A Hard Day's Night and mention that Hard Day's Night, this original 1964 Beatles movie directed by Richard Lester, it is very iconic. Obviously, it has very, very much some great scenes, but it's important to me specifically because I'm a big fan of the Beatles, and it introduced me to the Beatles in the cinematic world. At the very least, it's the first Beatles film I ever saw. I don't think it's their best one. I honestly think Help is a better film, and even better Yellow Submarine, which doesn't really involve the Beatles. They wrote the music, but they didn't voice the characters, and it's animated. I think Yellow Submarine is probably the best film, the best Beatles film. I put it in quotes because, like I said, they're not personally involved in it outside of writing the music. But A Hard Day's Night is the most iconic of their films, and it's important, and it has the energy that you expect from a movie exploring the beginnings of Beatlemania. Obviously, it was a very exuberant and exciting time. I think the Beatles found it terrifying eventually, but perhaps caught in the whirlwind in 1964, they probably thought it was more exciting than terrifying. By the time they'd reached 1965, they were thinking that it was a bit of both, and in 66 they thought it was hell. But this movie introduces you to the idea of how euphoric and exciting and just absolutely mindless crazy Beatlemania was. It's almost a snapshot in time. It's more documentary of the time period and of this band and of the effect they had on pop culture than it is really a story. There's not much of a story, so it's I like it as a document of the time and as a document of my favorite musical artists of all time and of probably the greatest influence on my life ever. So because of that, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to just mention it briefly at least. And now we get to it. First, I want to highlight another thing. I don't have the film, so I can't really talk about it, but one of the important things when I was a kid was action movies. My mom's boyfriend I mentioned earlier, Marc, he used to rent a lot of action movies, and I would watch these action movies with him. I had two very different upbringings because my parents divorced, like I said, when I was 2 or 3, and when they divorced, I ended up having two very different upbringings. At my mom's, things were very relaxed, and by relaxed I mean in terms of my movie watching habits. I could watch what I want. Violence, sex, nudity, bad language, foul language, whatever. I could do whatever I want. But at my dad's it was a little bit more strict. My dad's wife in particular didn't like bad language. She wasn't into violence and all that, and she, even when it came to nudity and stuff, I remember she would make my sister and I cover our eyes sometimes when there was a breast or something appearing on the screen. So violence wasn't something that I get to see a lot of when I was at my dad's. But my dad did take me in 1991 to see Terminator 2 Judgment Day at the drive-in. It was just him and I. His wife didn't come, my sister didn't come, just my dad and I. I remember that feeling, I remember that experience very well, that he took me to see this movie, and it became extremely important to me. For about 10 years it was my favorite film. Immediately it became my favorite film, and it stayed that way. And James Cameron became a huge hero of mine for a few years there, which is ironic today considering what I think of his later movies, and even in retrospect some of his earlier movies, because these days I don't actually think much of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but it is a film that was very important to me as a child, and eventually as a teenager, and even a young tween when I was in my early 20s. So I couldn't pass up the opportunity again to at least mention it, and mention the impact that Arnold Schwarzenegger had on me in particular. When I was young, I watched all his action movies, and at my mom's I could watch films like Commando and Predator and all those, Raw Deal and Red Heat, and you name them, I saw them. Red Sonja, even in the Conan movies. These movies, I saw them all when I was a kid, even though they were probably more mature than I should have. For a kid the age that I was at the time, they were probably a little too mature. They were all, a lot of them were, R-rated, some of them probably PG-13, and I was, not even 10 years old when I was watching these movies, but it didn't matter to me. It didn't matter to my mom. She let me watch them. So Schwarzenegger was important. Terminator 2 was very, very important in my development. So, and it brings me to another film, which, well, you're seeing it right now. This is the movie, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, playing here in the background, which is why it shows it as the background, because this is the movie that truly made me a cinephile. It's the movie that made me want to discover cinema for real. Now, I have to recount the story. People who are watching this, a few of you might remember that 4 years ago or so, I mentioned this yesterday when I did the other video. 4 years ago, Anthony Francis and I, we recorded a first episode of what was supposed to be a joint podcast of the two of us. He brought me this idea of doing a podcast in 2017, and eventually we settled on a name for it, which we called the Film Connection, in reference to the French Connection, William Friedkin's 1971 masterpiece. And when we decided this, we recorded a first episode, and we've never recorded a second one since. I don't need to go into details about it. I mentioned a little bit yesterday why, and like I said yesterday, it's still a plan that we will eventually do this. And I actually spoke to Anthony just earlier today about it, and confirmed to me that he was still in, and I'm still in. So it's going to happen eventually. I just don't know when. I'll let it go for now. And but I did mention when I did that podcast with Anthony, I told the story of how I came to see The Fellowship of the Ring in theaters, and I think it's going to feel like a rehash for those who listened to the earlier podcast with Anthony, but I think I need to recount it here again because it's seminal in my life and truly, truly instrumental in my development. The Lord of the Rings, particularly The Fellowship of the Ring, because it was my introduction to it, is one of the most important events that ever happened in my life. I'm not just talking about films. I'm not just talking about one of the most important films that came into my life. I'm talking the arrival of these movies, and especially the first one, because it was the first one, into my life, changed my life, my personal life. Prior to that, I mentioned earlier that I was playing guitar, and I continued playing guitar. And music was my life. I was doing concerts, I was doing gigs in bars, I was doing Saint Jean-Baptiste. Saint Jean-Baptiste is the Quebec equivalent in some ways of Independence Day in the U.S. It's a big event here. I did shows in front of 10,000 people at Saint Jean-Baptiste in Chateauguay. Canada Day I did as well a couple times. I did some fairly sizable gigs once in a while, and I did lots of gigs in bars and stuff, whether with myself as the leader of the band or as an accompanying musician once in a while. I did both. It was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun, but when I saw the Fellowship of the Ring, it changed everything. I decided that my time, which up until then was almost entirely devoted to my music, was now going to be devoted to, at least at first, discovering cinema and understanding cinema and becoming a cinephile. And eventually that led to me screenwriting as well, but I don't need to talk about that. It's not important. But I need to recount what happened. So one day, and I remember the day well, it was January 12th, 2002, by which point the Fellowship of the Ring had been out for almost a month. It came out, I still know the date, it came out December 19th, 2001, and I didn't go see it at the time. I had no interest. I wasn't into fantasy, to be clear. I had not read The Lord of the Rings, the book. I had read The Hobbit as a child, I believe in 8th, not remembering which, but at some point in school they made us do a book report in English class, and the book that was chosen for whatever reason was The Hobbit. I remember it well. I didn't know at the time. When I saw The Lord of the Rings, I did not remember about The Hobbit or anything. It's only when in 2003 I finally read the books. Before the release of The Return of the King in theaters, and after the release of The Two Towers in theaters, between those two moments I decided I was going to finally read The Lord of the Rings in anticipation of the release of Return of the King in theaters, and I got so caught up in it that my own plan, which was to stop at Two Towers, I was going to read Fellowship and The Two Towers, and I was going to stop there, wait till Return of the King came out in theaters, and then read King. But I was so caught up in it that I could not stop, and obviously there's many reasons for that. One of them being the fact that the book and the film, The Two Towers, end drastically differently. In the film, it ends after the Battle of Helm's Deep, but in the book, it ends with Frodo being seemingly killed by a giant spider, and I could not stop reading. I had to figure out if Frodo was dead or not. I didn't know about this book from this sequence from having seen the film, because it wasn't in the film. Turns out they put it in Return of the King. But it was important, and so yeah, only years later, in 2003, when I read finally The Lord of the Rings, and then I jumped right into reading The Hobbit. I got it for Christmas, I remember. And when I got it for Christmas, I read The Hobbit, and then I realized, oh my god, I've read this before. And I remembered this book report that I had done at some point in school, early high school. I believe it was, I'm trying to remember now, I'm not sure, but it would have been maybe 7th or 8th grade, so I'm not quite sure. But yeah, so I had done a book report on it, and then I remembered I had read it. But when I went and saw Fellowship, I didn't want to see it. This is the thing. Fellowship of the Ring came out, and I had no interest in seeing it. For whatever reason, I wasn't into fantasy at that time. I liked action movies, but I like action movies with car chases and fist fights and, shootouts and that sort of thing. Gun violence in general. I did not much like sword and sorcery type of stuff. I had seen, of course, the Conan movies, and I liked them because Schwarzenegger. But I wasn't into that particular genre at all, so for whatever reason I didn't want to see it. And there was another reason, which was linked to Terminator 2. Now, I had read, when Fellowship of the Ring came out, I did read some articles. It was all over the newspapers, obviously. They were talking about it everywhere because it was a big hit. And I did read some articles in the papers which were talking about this movie was the new revolution in visual effects. It was the next step forward in visual effects. It was going to help push visual effects forward in the same way that Terminator 2 had done 10 years earlier, or Jurassic Park perhaps 2 years after that. But and I remember in my mind I did not want to see it, one, because I didn't like fantasy, but also because I felt like I was betraying, this is silly, I felt I was betraying Terminator 2, because Terminator 2 was still my favorite film at that point. And I did not want to see another movie that was considered the new revolution in visual effects. It sounds really fucking dumb when I think about it today, but that is how I felt at the time. and therefore I refused to go see it. So about a month passes, and then one day, January 12th, I get a call from my friend Marc-André, and Marc-André calls me and he says, "You want?" And I remember this very well. It was one of those moments where you feel like you're having the most boring day of your life. Sorry, let me turn it down again. I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments, but it was one of those moments where I felt I was having one of the most boring days of my life, and I wanted to do something and go out, but I hadn't made any plans or anything. And suddenly, before I could start calling people up, he called me up and he asked me, "Do I want to go to a movie?" So I said, "Hallelujah, yeah, finally someone's proposed something to me." So yeah, I said, "Yes, sure." And then I naturally asked him if he had a movie in mind, and he said that he wanted to go see this movie, The Fellowship of the Ring. And I told him, never mind, I'm not interested. And I explained my reasons why regarding this. One, that I didn't like fantasy and this whole silly thing about not wanting to see the next revolution in visual effects. I remember telling him Terminator 2 is a masterpiece, and I don't need to see anything that supposedly supplants it. I don't believe it supplants it, and I didn't want to believe it. Anyway, so I hung up the phone and that was it, and I tried calling a bunch of friends, and no one answered for whatever reason. I didn't have that many friends back then, but anyway, no one actually answered. So I thought, well, okay, maybe another plan would be to page them all and see if they're going to call back. Because back in 2002, we're talking about the days of pagers. So I paged people, no one called me back. So I got into this mindset that I'm just going to go out and get drunk all alone in a bar. There's a bar that I used to go to, that we all used to hang out in, really. And I figured I'm going to go see José, the barmaid, and have a drink and talk with José all night, and that's going to be it, and get drunk and come back home and probably not remember anything. And that was the plan. And as I was preparing to go out, I was, shaving and that sort of thing, and I had hair back then, so putting hair in my, gel in my hair and whatnot. I was obsessed with making my hair look as good as possible. So I was putting my hair and shaving and whatever. And as I was doing all of this, doing my preparations to go out, and suddenly it hit me. I think I was shaving, I remember, and I thought to myself, you know what? I'm about to go out and spend, I don't know, $150, $200 just to buy myself a headache and a hangover, because I was a big drinker. I'm not a big drinker. I'm not a person who drinks often. But I've always been the type of guy in those days back in those days I did drink quite often, but I was also someone who drank a lot when he did drink, and I would always get very, very drunk until I didn't remember anything. And also, a thing about me is I always give very good tips, and the drunker I get, the bigger the tip gets, because the hotter I find the barmaid. So, and José was already particularly hot, so I thought to myself, I'm going to go there and I'm going to get drunk, and I'm going to spend $150, $200 on buying myself a headache and a hangover, when I could just go to the movies, spend $20, $25, if you count the movie, the popcorn and all that crap, and the gas for getting there and all that. I thought to myself it was more worth it to just spend that $20, $25 on just a movie, even if the movie turned out being shitty. It was more worth it than buying myself a hangover and another headache. So I called Marc-André back up. Thankfully, he had called me early enough that we had enough leeway to actually make plans. So I called him back up, and I said, I changed my mind, let's go. And he said, okay, cool, and we went. And in the car with him, I was discussing, he was asking me why I didn't want to see it at first, and I explained to him my reasons. I briefly explained on the phone, but more importantly, I explained on the car ride up, because we didn't go to the theater in my hometown, which is Chateauguay. This is a South Shore on the west side of Montreal. We decided to go to Ville LaSalle. Ville LaSalle is part of Montreal. It's also on the West Island, part of Montreal, but Chateauguay is outside of the island, and you have to cross the bridge. It's when there's no traffic or anything. It's, I don't know, maybe half an hour from Chateauguay to the movie theater. where we went, and so on the car ride up to Villa Sal and to the theater there, I was discussing my reasons and explaining this whole thing that I told you about not wanting to betray the Terminator 2 in my mind. I thought it was betraying my favorite film by going to see this other movie, which was considered the new revolution in special effects. And so I go and I sit, and obviously the theater gets quiet, and anyone who's seen Fellowship of the Ring by now knows that it starts completely black screen, and the logos appear on the screen, and Kate Blanchett's hypnotic voice appears, and speaking in Elvish in Quenya. Is it Quenya or Sindarin? No, it's Quenya. Speaking in Quenya, and introducing the world. The world has changed and all this, and I remember hearing her voice and just the mood of it, because the theater was dark, the screen was completely dark except for the titles appearing in silver, and just the sound of Kate Blanchett's voice, which was so enthralling, that the way she spoke the words she was speaking, I felt taken back in time. It was very strange. I remember hearing her voice and the black screen and everything. To me, it felt like I was taken back in time thousands of years ago. It sounded ancient. Even maybe the use of the Elvish language helped that, and the sound of Kate Blanchett's voice itself, the way she spoke the words, made it sound like it was something very old, and like someone very wise was speaking something from long ago. I remember being enthralled by that and being absolutely hypnotized by the sound of her voice and by the black screen. I was transfixed by it, and then the title, The Lord of the Rings, appears in gold, and I believe the first shot, if I'm not mistaken, is candles which are lit and reveal the forging of the rings, the three rings of the elves. And when I saw that, I was very impressed. I thought to myself, well, this is going to be a very strange and unique ride. And 7 minutes later, the prologue ends. There's a long prologue, as everyone knows now. And this prologue ends, and I was sold. I was in this world. I had completely left the theater. I was no longer sitting in the theater. I was right there. I was in the movie. And that changed my life. I walked out of the theater silent as hell. I was flabbergasted. I had never seen anything like it. I could not believe. I was also shocked because, having not read the book, I didn't know that it was divided into 3 parts. And I didn't know that I was going to have to wait until I saw the conclusion of the story. I figured, by the time that I figured out that the story was about destroying this ring, I figured it would be destroyed by the end of the movie. But obviously that's not the case. It's a trilogy, and it was going to be done two movies later. But even despite that, even despite not understanding that it was going to be a trilogy, I was shocked, and I remember thinking, this is my new favorite film. Like, immediately that changed everything. And walking out, I was very silent. I couldn't say anything. I was sort of at a loss for words. And going into the parking lot, as I mentioned, I had already said to Marc-André that to me Terminator 2 was a masterpiece. And walking into the parking lot towards the car, at some point when we got very near the car, Marc-André broke the silence. He was silent too, and he broke the silence, and he said, "That was a masterpiece." In French, he said in French, "Ça c'est un chef-d'œuvre." And I said, yeah, that was something else, or whatever version of that I might have said in French. And it changed my life, and since then, well, I've held fast to the fact that The Lord of the Rings is, as a whole, still one of the most important things in my life. I do consider now that Return of the King has many issues. The extended cut of the Return of the King, I think, has many piss-poor scenes that have been added to it, which were not in the theatrical cut. But I do still think that, seen as a whole, despite the flaws of Return of the King, this is a masterpiece, and it is one of the great accomplishments and achievements in the history of cinema. A few years ago, I posted a list of the 1,000 greatest movies of all time, in my opinion. And The Lord of the Rings, it ended up in my top 10. I believe it was number 8 or something. maybe even number 7. I've changed my mind since then on that, largely because I think Return of the King is weaker. But despite that, I do think that even if it's not one of the 10 greatest films ever made, it is one of the 10 greatest achievements in the history of cinema. And by that I mean that nothing else. I mean in the fact that it was thought to be impossible, and he managed to do it, and he managed to do it so well. And it was so flabbergastingly, mind-bogglingly huge, and that he managed to make something that made sense out of this, even though it doesn't always follow the books now, I know that, but it's just so huge, and it was done with so much passion, so much love for it too. It's impossible to think that there will ever be another achievement quite like this in the history of popular cinema. Purely as an achievement, I think it's... I remember there's a reviewer who said something, I don't remember who it is, but someone said in 2003 when The Return of the King came out, no director has ever aimed higher and achieved more. And in a way, this is true. With this trilogy, maybe not in terms of the intellectual exercise or whatever, but in terms of pure cinema, no one has ever made something that reaches the heights of The Lord of the Rings, and I don't think no one ever will again, because these days studios have agendas and whatnot, and I'm sure they had agendas with this too, but they gave Peter Jackson a lot of creative license to do what he wanted. And thank you, Peter Jackson, you changed my life. Truly, you did. And The Lord of the Rings cannot be understated as an important thing in my life. But from then, I decided immediately I want to discover cinema, and I want to become a cinephile, and I don't know how to do that because, contrary to some people, I didn't grow up in cinematic households. Some of my friends, Anthony is a good example because he's spoken about this with me personally. He had a dad who was sort of a teacher of cinema for him. He taught him films by Kurosawa, he taught him films by Ray Harryhausen, and by many others. He made him see films by Renoir or whatever. He broadened his mind when it comes to cinema. I didn't really have that. I had a little bit of it because, like I said, I had two different upbringings. At my mom's, I would be seeing these very violent movies. I could see the action movies with lots of blood and cursing and all of that. And at my dad's, I would be seeing stuff like The Wizard of Oz. It was very almost schizophrenic as an upbringing when you think about it. I had to be two different people in both places. It was weird, but I think it opened me up to the idea that I could see things that were very different. My mind wasn't restricted to one type of film. I think if my parents had remained together, perhaps I would have seen only one type of film for a long time. But the fact that I saw violent action movies at my mom's, and then sometimes more artistic things at my dad's, like I said, I mentioned The Wizard of Oz, but there were others, stuff like Mary Poppins and E.T., and there were movies that I saw at my dad's that I would not have seen at my mom's. Even stuff like Beetlejuice. My dad was a fan of Beetlejuice, and Star Wars. My mom was never a fan of Star Wars or Indiana Jones. I would have seen those movies more at my dad's, so there was a good mix of stuff. And also, the other thing was I grew up in two languages. At my dad's, everything was in English. I didn't spend much time at my dad's. Of course, I lived with my mom, and I only visited my dad every second weekend, every other weekend. But when I did visit my dad, I would see stuff in English. And at my mom's, I would see a lot of stuff in French. So I grew up open to seeing films in more than one language, which probably explains my love these days for a lot of foreign cinema, because a lot of people, especially in America, when I say America, I include Canada in this, they grew up in households where they only speak one language. And because they speak one language, they're a little bit more closed-minded to seeing things that are outside of their comfort zone. But me, because I grew up with two languages, I think I grew up comfortable with the idea of exploring stuff in other languages. So that was a benefit, actually, that schizophrenic upbringing and schizophrenic in genre of films that I saw, but schizophrenic also in the terms that I had to deal with two languages, and opened me up and broadened my mind. So the first thing I did, I didn't quite know what to do, but there was one thing I knew. I knew of Jack Nicholson. Well, there were two things I knew. One, I knew that Jack Nicholson was considered one of the great actors. I didn't know much about his films. I had seen, obviously, Batman, and I had seen one or two others when I was younger, but I didn't know much about him. But I knew that he was considered a great actor, and he had made a very commercial film, which was Batman. And I knew that I liked that movie, so I knew that I liked him as an actor, despite not knowing much of his work. So he was an introduction for me. He was an entry point, in a way. Lord of the Rings made me very much want to... It told me, okay, now your life is going to be cinema. Go and discover cinema as an art form. It brought my mind to what cinema could be, and also to what a director is, but I don't need to get into that. I'll talk about it the day I make a podcast on the film. But the other entry point, yes, was Jack Nicholson, because I knew of him. I had seen Batman, which I loved. I had seen a couple other movies, though the titles didn't remain with me. And I knew that he was a great actor, and I knew that I liked him. So I figured maybe if I start with him, I can find an entry point into some other great films by great filmmakers. And the other thing was there was a publication, there still is a publication here in Quebec called Media Film. Now, Media Film are a film critic, film review publication. They've existed since as far back, I think, as 1968. And they're a bit of an institution in the world of film criticism here in Quebec and in Canada. And they review films, but they have a unique rating system. They rate films 1 to 7. 1 is their highest level, a masterpiece, and 7 is the lowest, atrocious. And so they have 7 ratings from 1 to 7. 1 masterpiece, 2 remarkable, 3 very good, 4 good, 5, I guess the proper term translation, because it's in French, would be below average, or perhaps just average. In English you would say nah. That's the equivalent of a rating of 5. 6 is bad and 7 is atrocious. And I figured I would check out this publication, because this publication used to, well, for one thing, Media Film used to have, I believe, their own physical publication, their journal. But they also had, they were also in all the TV guides here in Quebec. There were TV guides, and every time you looked up the timetables of movies and whatnot, they would have the Media Film rating and a little bit of short little insight into their review. And so I started looking up ratings of Jack Nicholson's films from this particular publication. I started cross-referencing basically Jack Nicholson with Media Film and looking at the ratings, and I was looking for films that were rated 1, 2, and 3, the best ratings of Media Film. Masterpiece, remarkable, and very good. And in this I found numerous films that were rated 3, but also a few that were rated 1 and 2. At the time, Chinatown was already rated 1, I believe. And The Shining, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Reds were films that were rated 2. Remarkable. And so I figured I'd go to the video store. There was a video store in Quebec called the Super Club Vidéotron, which is the equivalent that we had of Blockbuster Video, although we did have Blockbuster Video, but we had both. But it was sort of the equivalent of that. And so I went to this place, Super Club Vidéotron, and I decided I was going to rent some Jack Nicholson movies that had the best ratings. I looked at a bunch of titles, and I found a bunch that were also rated 3. But I looked for these 4 that were rated 1 and 2. So I looked for Chinatown, I found it, I rented it. I looked for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I found it and rented it. I looked for The Shining, I found it and rented it, and I have a story to tell about that. And I looked for Reds, and I didn't find that one, but I did find The Two Jakes, which was rated 3 by Media Film. Might seem strange to a lot of people. They would assume that it's not rated better than 4 or even 5. It's not a very beloved film, but Media Film were generous with it. They rated it 3. So I saw The Two Jakes and I took it home. So I rented those 4 films: Chinatown, The Shining, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and The Two Jakes, not knowing, by the way, that The Two Jakes was actually the sequel to Chinatown, and not knowing to the point that I actually watched The Two Jakes first, because the title, Chinatown, even though the film was rated 1, sounded boring to me. So I watched The Two Jakes first, not realizing I was watching the sequel to Chinatown, and when I did watch Chinatown, it didn't even hit me at the moment that I had just watched the prequel to the film that I had already watched, and it was only years later that I discovered that they were sequels to one another, that they were a series, a diptych if you want, that they were meant to be a triptych. But anyway, but the first one I watched in the bunch was, very importantly, was Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Now, I knew the name Stanley Kubrick because I remember when Stanley Kubrick died in 1999, it was all over the newspapers talking about this potentially greatest filmmaker who ever lived. A lot of people thought that. It was an opinion that was generally held by a lot of people, that he was the greatest filmmaker of all time. And then I knew that he was considered one of the great filmmakers, so that was another entryway for me into discovering more about cinema. But the important thing about The Shining, this is the wrong box, unfortunately, and the 4K edition does not have the right box to it. But I remembered from my childhood the image of Jack Nicholson looking through the door of the bathroom, yelling, "Here's Johnny." That particular moment is something that I remembered from my childhood, which means I had seen that movie, but I had no idea which movie it came from. I couldn't even have told you that it came from a movie with Jack Nicholson. I just remembered the image of someone in a bathroom or in a door frame of some sort, a broken down door frame, yelling, "Here's Johnny." That was an image that had marked my imagination, much like the moon and the bicycle in E.T. It was one of those images that had stayed with me since my childhood, so I had seen it. And when I went to the video store to rent these movies, I had in mind that I was going to rent The Shining, not knowing that it was that movie. And then I saw the box and the DVD, or I'm not sure if it was DVD or VHS, I honestly don't remember. I had a DVD player at the time, which I bought actually on 9/11, September 11, 2001. I bought my first DVD player. But I remember very well that the box itself, whether it was VHS or DVD, was the image of Jack Nicholson yelling, "Here's Johnny," in the doorframe of the bathroom. And that was suddenly I realized, oh my God, this is the movie. I remember that image. And what's more, it's one of the films that I was coming to rent, and that was rated 2 by Media Film, so I was very happily surprised. So I rented it, and it's the first one I watched because I knew that I had seen it as a child and I wanted to see it again. And suddenly all the images came flowing back to me. I remembered, the 2 little girls in the blue dress in the blue dresses, I should say, in the hallway, saying, "Come play with us, Danny." I remembered the blood flowing out of the elevator's very iconic image, and obviously the red rum written across the bedroom door, red rum, with Danny's creepy voice saying "red rum," and Danny Lloyd. And I remembered also the big wheels ride across the Overlook Hotel, and I even remember the specific sounds of it going across the wooden floor, and then the muffled sound on the carpet and the wooden floor again, and the tracking shots of the camera behind it. I suddenly, these images flowed back into my mind, and I realized something, which is something that had hit me with The Fellowship of the Ring, that clearly this was made by someone that had a vision, a very personal vision. I realized that cinema was a director's medium, and suddenly I needed to explore a little bit more Stanley Kubrick, but more importantly, I wanted to discover who the great filmmakers were, because I knew Stanley Kubrick was considered one of them. And if you start reading about Stanley Kubrick, and this is the thing about me, if I really like something, I will read everything I can, watch all the videos I can. Internet wasn't that big back then, YouTube didn't exist, but it still was possible to see some videos and stuff, but on DVDs and stuff. And so I tried to get as much information as I could, and just as I had done in my teenage years and read every Beatles book that I could get my hands on at school and at the library, I did the same thing with Stanley Kubrick. I started reading books about Stanley Kubrick and discovered, who his influences are. Among them, I discovered Max Ophuls. He was a particularly big fan also of Ingmar Bergman, who was an important one for me. I'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. And because of that, it became obvious that Stanley Kubrick was going to be my first real big entry into quote-unquote serious cinema. But I didn't immediately start watching Stanley Kubrick films, but I finished my Jack Nicholson marathon, which led me to this movie. And yeah, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. After I saw The Fellowship of the Ring, this was the next film that I saw that I suddenly decided was my favorite film of all time. I had seen it before. I had seen it with my mom. My mom was a fan of this movie. And yes, I had seen it before, but it hadn't really stuck with me when I saw it, maybe because I was a teenager and it was too serious. But then I saw it again as an adult, and it automatically became one of my favorite films ever. And for a while there, I was alternating saying The Lord of the Rings is my favorite film as a whole, considering it one piece, even though it's a trilogy. And then I would say, no, actually, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is my favorite film, and I would go back and forth between the two of them. It's hard to decide even today which of the two I prefer, but yeah, it was very much my favorite film for a while, and it made Jack Nicholson my favorite actor. That's an important aspect, because up until then, my favorite actor had been Arnold Schwarzenegger, because that's what I had grown up watching. Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Steven Seagal, Jean-Claude Van Damme, but Schwarzenegger was the one who had stuck the most with me. His films like Commando and Predator and whatnot, they were, highlights of my young life. But Jack Nicholson became my favorite actor with this movie, and still to this day, I wouldn't say it's the greatest performance ever given by an actor, but it's probably my favorite. And I'll get to my favorite. I'll get to the greatest performance ever given by an actor a little bit later. But this automatically became my favorite performance ever given by an actor. It remains such a powerful, moving, and uproariously funny movie, actually, a lot of the times. But it's also, and I was always a little bit of a rebel, so I think I related a little bit to R.P. McMurphy, sorry. R.P. is definitely a rebel caught up in a oppressive and regime or autocratic regime, and so I had viewed school as an oppressive regime a lot of the time. I think maybe as a teenager I viewed my mom as somewhat oppressive and whatnot, and that's how you are when you're a teenager. But yeah, so it had an impact on me, because I realized that I could relate to R.P. McMurphy, even though he's also he's committed statutory rape, which I haven't, but it was an important thing for me that he was that he was also a rebel. But to this day, it's one of the most moving films I've ever seen, and I still think it's just a film of elemental force, really. I think it's just beautiful. And this leads me to mentioning very briefly another Jack Nicholson one, The Departed. I'm only mentioning this for two reasons. It was the first Jack Nicholson film I saw in theaters. It was not the first Martin Scorsese film that I saw in theaters. I had seen Gangs of New York previously. But it was the first Jack Nicholson film I saw in theaters. And it's important because it led me to friendships, especially on Facebook. Stephen McCoy in particular. He and I bonded over this particular movie, so I wanted to give a shout out to Stephen McCoy, because this movie was important to both of us. We bonded over this particular movie, and it does remain one of my favorite movies, and I am eventually going to do a podcast on this particular movie. It's not I don't think it's one of Martin Scorsese's top 10 greatest films, but it is one of my favorites, and it's a film that I watch about twice a year because I love it so much, probably even more than twice a year. I had a lot of fun with it, and it is not a masterpiece. I think it has slight flaws. I could have done without the Vera Farmiga side story. Honestly, I don't think that there needs to be a love story in the film. But whatever my personal feelings regarding perceived flaws that it might have, I still think it's a really entertaining movie and brilliantly written, some of the best dialogue of Scorsese's career, and obviously a great soundtrack as well. So really love this movie, and it means a lot to me, and it's especially important because it led me to develop certain Facebook friendships, especially with Stephen McCoy. So a little bit with Courtney as well. So I thought I should mention it. But in the same way that E.T. led me to speak about Jaws because it's my favorite Spielberg film, The Departed leads me to talk about my favorite Martin Scorsese film, Goodfellas. I watched Goodfellas again last night. I've mentioned this a million times before, but Goodfellas could possibly be my favorite film of all time. I never actually give it that official title. I've never actually said Goodfellas is my favorite film of all time, but it is very worthy of holding that distinction in the sense that it's a film that when I don't know what to watch, usually I put this one on. It's one of the rare films that whenever I watch it, I'm always completely entertained by it. And beyond the fact that it's entertaining, it is brilliantly made. It is one of the best directed films I have ever seen. And in my opinion, Thelma Schoonmaker's film editing in this film is the best in the history of cinema. I think Goodfellas is the best edited film of all time. And the final sequence, well, it's not necessarily the final sequence, but one of the final sequences in the film, which Scorsese is referred to as the Last Days of Wise Guy sequence, that entire sequence, I believe is the best edited piece of filmmaking that has ever been assembled. It could be the most brilliant thing I've ever witnessed in cinema in terms of just the way it's put together. And yes, it is. I'm sorry, Francis Ford Coppola. I'm sorry, Sergio Leone. This is the best gangster film ever made. Roger Ebert was right on this, and he and I didn't agree very often, but Roger Ebert was right. The best mob movie ever. I believe there's never been anything quite like it, and it is one of the best directed films of all time. It's absolutely masterful, and I get pleasure out of it all the time, so which is why I just had to highlight it here and mention it as part of my journey. But it's also an ironic one because when I first saw this movie, I actually didn't like it. I didn't even finish it. I rented it years ago, and I fell asleep to it. I couldn't finish it, and I never finished it. And then I went back to it a few years later, and it became automatically one of my favorite movies. But it is ironic because I did not like it at all the first time. But yes. And talking about Martin Scorsese, one thing to mention about Scorsese is if you start reading, again, if I'm passionate about something, I will read about everything, and in his case, watch all the interviews. There are many. One of the things about Scorsese is he's an encyclopedia of cinema. He knows everything about cinema. And if you start reading about him and watching interviews, he tells you so much stuff about other filmmakers that you can't help wanting to explore the filmmakers that influenced him. Italian neorealism obviously was important to him. He's talked about Fellini quite a lot in his life, and also he's talked about Rossellini and people like that. But he's talked about the French New Wave. He's talked about Golden Age of Hollywood. He's touched upon that. He's obviously made a film about Georges Méliès. He's talked about. He's made films. A film about about Howard Hughes, who was a producer who produced some Howard Hawks movies, but he also directed a few of his own. He's an important landmark. And the thing about Scorsese is because he's so knowledgeable and because he's talked about other filmmakers so much. I said this when I did the podcast with Anthony. I'm going to say it again. It's like a spider web with him. He's at the center of the web, and then there are all these threads which link him to other filmmakers, which are the people who influenced him. And he talks about them with such passion that you can't help but want to discover them as well. And I've discovered many films and cinephiles and filmmakers simply because I watched some Martin Scorsese interviews. Films like Les Enfants du Paradis de Georges Carnet, Marcel Carnet film from I believe 1945. Jean Renoir's The River. I've discovered tons of films and film Red Shoes, obviously, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. I've discovered tons of filmmakers from before his time simply because he talked about them and I wanted to discover what he loved. He's talked about Howard Hawks, he's talked about John Ford, he's talked about Houston, he's talked about so many American contemporaries of his, and also previous to him. Obviously it leads you to want to discover new Hollywood and discovering Spielberg and De Palma and Coppola and all these people. But it also leads you to want to discover the people he himself influenced, and this is where I get to a filmmaker who not only is, in my opinion, the greatest American filmmaker working today, but also, in my opinion, the greatest filmmaker, period, of the last 25 years. And by that I mean that he's directed the most masterpieces in the last 25 years, and that is Paul Thomas Anderson and this magnificent film called There Will Be Blood. There Will Be Blood is not my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson film. I've said this many times. The Master is my favorite. Everyone hates it but me. Well, maybe not everyone, but Anthony hates it and Courtney hates it. I don't know where other people in my friend list stand about it, but The Master might be my favorite, but I decided to highlight this one for two reasons. The first is, I think it's the most important of his career. It's the one he'll be remembered for 50 years from now, 100 years from now. It's probably the best one. I prefer The Master, and I wonder if The Master isn't as good as this one. But it could be that this is the better film. I'm not quite sure. It's hard to decide for me. I think it's a bloody masterpiece, that's for sure. And it is the greatest film about America, I think, made since The Godfather. The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 is the great American saga of the second half of the 20th century. There's no doubt about that. In terms of cinema, there hasn't been a greater saga about America done. But I think in the 21st century, the great one is There Will Be Blood. I think it's on par with the Godfather films in terms of being that. It's obviously about greed and corruption, and it's about, capitalism is at the center of the film. But also at the center of the film is one of the greatest performances ever given by an actor, the great Daniel Day-Lewis, who I will talk about him at some other point in time. But Daniel Day-Lewis gives one of the great screen performances in this, certainly one of the greats of the 21st century. Some people consider it the greatest of all time. I think that's a bit hyperbolic for my taste. It is one of the great ones, but I don't actually think it's Daniel Day-Lewis's greatest performance, but it is probably his most fascinating character that he has played. It is something else, and it's worth seeing, if just for him, but it's worth seeing for so many other things. Obviously, Robert Elswit. Elswit's cinematography in it is a thing of beauty. It won an Oscar, not for no reason. And Johnny Greenwood's score is one of the greatest ever composed. So I love this film so much, and I rewatched it maybe once or twice a year. And probably one of the darkest films I've ever seen, but it is impossible to take my eyes off. And that leads me to just a little segue. I don't have the film with me because I don't actually own it. To a little segue about Daniel Day-Lewis, who I think gives the greatest performance of all time, given by a male actor, in Jim Sheridan's My Left Foot. It got him his first Oscar in 1990. I believe, for my money, I'm not saying Daniel Day-Lewis is the greatest actor who's ever lived. In my opinion, the greatest actor who's ever lived is Robert De Niro. I think no one's screen resume compares to Robert De Niro's, even though you can say that it's been spotty in the last 20-25 years. He does have some greats in there as well, most recently Killers of the Flower Moon and The Irishman, or even his work in The Silver Linings Playbook, which I thought was beautiful, even though I'm not a big fan of the film. But yes, I think Robert De Niro is the greatest actor of all time, screen actor that is. But if you were to ask me who gave the greatest single performance, Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot, in my opinion, gave the single greatest performance ever given by a male actor that I've ever seen. It's absolutely incredible, and you have to see it to believe it. But this leads me to talk not just about the greatest performance ever given by a female actor that I've ever seen, but in my opinion, the greatest performance ever given by anyone, male or female, in the history of cinema. And I'm talking about the great René Falconetti in Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 masterpiece, The Passion of Joan of Arc. It is one of the greatest films of all time, but Falconetti, sometimes known as Maria Falconetti, I prefer using the name René Falconetti, it is the greatest screen performance I've ever seen. Obviously, by today's standards, it looks over the top and whatnot, but histrionic almost. But I think silent cinema sort of works very well for that time. And it was the last silent film that Dreyer made. It is not my favorite Dreyer film. That is actually Ordette, which he made in 1955. I will eventually highlight that film when I do an episode on it. But this is the greatest screen performance I've ever seen, and it's tremendous. And moves me to tears every time I see it. And because of that, I had to speak about it. And this leads me to talking a little bit more about silent films. I thought I should highlight a few silent films, and you can't discuss silent films without stopping to mention Charlie Chaplin, obviously. Modern Times is, along with Gold Rush, my favorite of Charlie Chaplin's. And the reason I chose to highlight this one and not the Gold Rush, which I might consider Gold Rush the better film, I'm not sure, I'd have to rewatch both back to back. This one is not completely silent, of course. It has sound effects to it and doesn't contain any dialogue, but it contains a sequence of Chaplin singing a song in a gibberish language that he himself made up for the sequence. But it is essentially a silent film apart from sound effects. But the reason I chose to highlight this one and not the Gold Rush, even though Gold Rush might be my favorite, I chose this one for the reason that it holds a special place in my heart, because I used to watch it with a little girl that I used to babysit when she was young, Sabrina. Sabrina, si t'es en train d'écouter, tu sais de quoi je parle. Les temps modernes de Charlie Chaplin. When she was a kid, sometimes my mom babysat Sabrina, and I spent a lot of time with her as well. I babysat her sometimes as well. And we spent a lot of time together. I remember the summer of 2008, I spent the whole summer with her, and almost the entire summer. And that particular summer was important. But this is a movie that her and I would watch a lot together. And for some reason, there were others. Peter Jackson's King Kong was another one, and she would cry when she watched that. It moved me to tears to watch her move to tears. And the same thing happened with, we would watch Corpse Bride once in a while. But this one I decided to highlight because I was doing a segue into silent films. So I figured I should mention a Chaplin film, and this one is important to me because Sabrina was important to me, and this was an important film as a connection between the two of us. This leads me talking to my favorite of all silent films, and one of my 10 favorite films ever made. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. Usually he's known as F.W. Murnau, and the film is sometimes just called Nosferatu. As we all know now, Robert Eggers, or is it Eggers? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Robert Eggers is how I pronounce it. Is releasing his own version of this at Christmas, which is apparently going to be an homage to this in some ways. I'm looking forward to that. But to me, Nosferatu, Symphony of Horror remains my favorite and probably the greatest horror film ever made. Of course, it's aged. It it's very much of its time because it's a silent film, and silent films are not, they don't hold up very well in terms of the film language and the acting style and whatnot, but it's an important film for the development of horror cinema. It's an important film for the development of German expressionistic cinema. Obviously, I could talk about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Robert Wiene's 1920 masterpiece, but I prefer this one as a film experience. I prefer this one. Wiene's film was probably more instrumental in developing German expressionism, but this is certainly my favorite film, and certainly over time, Murnau has proved to be the more historically significant of the two filmmakers, because he made other films that were as great as this one. But this is undoubtedly my favorite silent film and my favorite Murnau film and my favorite one of my 10 favorite films of all time, probably. And important to mention, earlier I said that there was a link that was going to do, and obviously Max Schreck is the lead actor in this film, who plays Count Dracula, or actually Count Orlok is the name he's given in this version. And as Count Orlok, Max Schreck gives a hallucinating performance, really one of the great performances of the silent era of cinema. And obviously Tim Burton was very influenced by this. I'm sure when he made the film that he was influenced by this, and probably Daniel Waters, who's someone on my friend list who's a screenwriter of Batman Returns. He is a screenwriter of that movie, and shout out to you again. But I assume that was an influence on them when they wrote the character of Max Schreck, which is played by I was going to say Willem Dafoe, but not Willem Dafoe, Christopher Walken. So it resonates all the way to, 70 years later? This film was made in 1922, and I think it still holds up, and Max Schreck's performance holds up as one of the greats of that era. And because of that, I love this film, which leads me to highlight another film. I have to highlight another film from Murnau for one particular reason. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. Now, Sunrise is not my favorite Murnau film. As I mentioned, Nosferatu is. But whether it's one of my favorites or not, it is, in my opinion, and probably being hyperbolic, and this is extremely subjective. Don't take this as any sort of serious opinion, but it is, in my opinion, Sunrise, the greatest film ever made. In my opinion, there has never been a greater film. It is a silent film, 1927. It was on the cusp of the moment where sound film met sound film, because obviously The Jazz Singer came out in 1927, the first official sound film. But Sunrise, in my opinion, is the greatest film ever made. It's probably the most... it's incredible what Murnau and his cinematographer managed to accomplish back in those days. I don't know. And by the way, it is the first winner, along with Wings. I believe William Wellman, I believe, directed Wings. It is the first winner of Best Picture at the Oscars of all time. Wings won Best Picture, or Best, I don't remember the term that they used back in 1927, but this one won Best Artistic Picture. There were two Best Picture categories, and Sunrise won the very first Best Picture Oscar along with Wings, all the way back in 1927, and very deserved for what I think is the greatest film ever made. One of the beautiful love stories, but it's also a very sad one. Obviously, it's the story of a man who wants to murder his wife and supplant her with his mistress, then feels guilty and spends the rest of the movie trying to win his wife back. It's a beautiful story, but the cinematography is something else. Yeah, one of my favorite films. Not my favorite, but yeah, high up there. Sound cinema obviously leads you to wanting to discover films that are a little less conventional, because sound cinema is not something that follows the conventions of modern cinema. Modern cinema is very different from silent cinema, and because of that, sometimes when you discover silent cinema, if you actually like it, like I did, you might want to discover stuff that is a little bit more out there, and that is a little bit more I'm not sure how to put it, but that is a little bit less conventional in its structural patterns and whatnot, and films that tell a story in a different way, basically. And this leads you to discovering, I'm going to highlight two films now. The Thin Red Line, Terrence Malick's 1998 masterpiece. In my opinion, the greatest war film ever made. And, well, there's actually a debate among that, because the next film that one of the next films I'm going to present is also kind of a war film. But, yeah, the greatest war film ever made, and in my opinion, one of the 10 greatest films ever made. And there is a sequence in this film which is a sequence of an attack on a Japanese camp, which is my favorite sequence ever shot in film history. I believe it is the best sequence ever assembled for a film. Again, I mentioned in Scorsese's Goodfellas earlier, I was talking about The Last Days of Wise Guy being the greatest sequence in film history. That I was speaking specifically of the editing and the montage of it, and also of the soundtrack, because I didn't mention it, but the soundtrack of that movie is just glorious. It's the greatest soundtrack ever assembled. When I say soundtrack, I'm not talking about the film score. I'm talking about, you know, a needle drop soundtrack. It's the greatest needle drop soundtrack ever assembled, Goodfellas. And that particular sequence is just such a masterful assembly of sound and music and fury and images and outstanding editing. But the sequence of the attack on the Japanese camp in this particular movie moves me to tears. I think it's the best sequence I've ever seen, not necessarily in terms of the editing of the cinematography. It's just the sequence, as it does have beautiful editing and cinematography, but it's just the sequence as a whole, and the way it plays out and the emotion it gives off and the use of the music again. I think it's the greatest sequence just ever filmed. I don't think I've ever seen it is the summit and the apex of cinema for me. It's the greatest that the art form of cinema has ever reached. Cinema has never reached a higher level than that, in my opinion, as art. And because of that, I have to acknowledge this film, and it is my favorite Terrence Malick film, whose first 5 films are probably masterpieces. Maybe not The New World, but Anthony would disagree with me on that because it's his favorite. But I think the first 5 films, perhaps excluding The New World, depends which cut. He has 3 cuts of it. I think the first 5 are masterpieces. Everything else, however, is another story. But yes, and it's a film that is very atypical, and it changed my perception of what cinema could be. Another film that changed my perception of what cinema could be, and now I have to lean in, is here's Ingmar Bergman and this amazing box set that Criterion put together, 39 films, 42 cuts, because 3 of the films have 2 cuts. In this particular set, there is one film which is, in my opinion, the best he's ever made, called Persona. Now, Ingmar Bergman is very important to me. He is, in my opinion, the greatest filmmaker who has ever lived. When I say the greatest filmmaker, I mean the one who has made the most masterpieces and the most films that are potentially to be considered masterpieces. He has at least 7 films that I would, without a shadow of a doubt, immediately tell you they're masterpieces. You know, starting with The Seventh Seal in 57, and 57, 56, I think it's 56, and following with Wild Strawberries, The Virgin Spring. After that, he made Through a Glass Darkly, Persona, Cries and Whispers, Fanny and Alexander. Those 7 movies, for me, they are 7 full-fledged masterpieces, undeniable, incontrovertible masterpieces. He has a few others which might also be considered masterpieces. Certainly his TV series, Cries and Whispers, from 1973 is also a masterpiece in many ways. Certainly the long TV cut, he cut a shorter version for American cinemas. But the long TV cut, I believe, is also a masterpiece. And perhaps Autumn Sonata, and perhaps the entirety of his Faith trilogy or Silence of God trilogy, which includes Through a Glass Darkly, but also Winter Light, which I believe is Ben Worley's favorite Bergman film and one of his favorite films, period. And also the Silence. I think those films are probably all masterpieces, but he certainly has 7 that I could never doubt. But in total, he has 17 or 18 films that I would argue are at least potential masterpieces, including the 7 that actually are. No one has ever made as many great films as Ingmar Bergman. Of course, he also made a lot of ones, you know, especially early in his career, prior to Summer with Monica, I guess in 53 was the first truly great one. So prior to that, he made a few that were a little bit more ordinary, but and then even after that, he made a few which were shaky. Certainly, Serpent's Egg and The Touch and a couple others. What is the... man, I forget the title right now. It has the word women in the title. All These Women, 1964, which I think is the worst film he's ever made. The first one he made in color, though. But, yes, I think Persona in particular is one of the greatest films ever made. In fact, I rank it... I already told you that Sunrise is, in my opinion, the greatest film ever made. But I tend to say that Persona might be the number 2 or number 3. Obviously, again, hyperbolic and highly subjective, but yes, potentially the second greatest film ever made, maybe number 3. Which leads me to the other film that might be number 2 or number 3. Akira Kurosawa and Ran, 1985. Kurosawa, another filmmaker who has quite a few masterpieces under his belt. I believe this is the greatest of his films and the greatest Japanese film of all time. And this is the other one that I was saying when I said that The Thin Red Line is the greatest war film of all time. Well, Ran is kind of a war film as well. It's an epic. It's got more in common perhaps with Lawrence of Arabia than it does with Saving Private Ryan. But it is very much also a war film. It's about a war between clans and between warring factions of the same family. So it is one of the greatest films ever made. I go back and forth between, like I said, Sunrise is number 1, but between Persona, Bergman's Persona, and Kurosawa's Ran, I go back and forth which one is number 2, which one is number 3, which just means that basically they're both as good as one another. And this is just personal, I don't know, very personal opinion. But yeah, cinema has rarely reached the heights that Kurosawa attained with this particular masterpiece. And some people, back in the 80s when it was released, it was declared the film of the century by some critics, and they weren't necessarily wrong. It is quite an astonishing film. It's too bad that it never got a good restoration, even this 4K from Studio Canal, and doesn't look as good as it should. And by the way, my disc is also, for some reason, it doesn't play properly. It freezes at some point, and I lose a whole 10-minute sequence. There's a Blu-ray copy on it, which I haven't yet watched, and the colors are actually better on the Blu-ray than on the 4K. So eventually I'll have to actually watch the Blu-ray. I did a comparison just to check the colors, and they were highly superior to the 4K copy that comes with it. So I'm looking forward to rewatching it eventually, and I'll definitely do a podcast on this one when I rewatch it. But yes, cinema rarely ever reached these heights ever again, and probably never did before. And finally, I had to end on what is my favorite film of all time, or what I often name my favorite film of all time, even though I go back and forth. Sometimes I say Lord of the Rings, sometimes I say Goodfellas, I've said One Flew the Cuckoo's Nest, but the film that for the last, I don't know, I think it was 2016 that I officially made it official that this movie, Zhang Yimou's Raise the Red Lantern, 1991, is my favorite film of all time. I like films about, I don't know why, I like films about oppression of women. For some reason, I like films that deal with, well, the theme of oppression in general is something that I enjoy in cinema. There's quite a lot of films in my collection which deal with the idea of some form of oppressive regime. One Flew the Cuckoo's Nest was another one, I mentioned it earlier. But this one particularly about the suppression or oppression of women. And I think I find it particularly moving because of that. I like films which deal with that particular theme. And Zhang Yimou made films quite early on in his career which all dealt with the condition of women in China in a different period. Like Red Sorghum, his first film, dealt with that as well, which also starred Gong Li. And some of the other films that he made during that period, the story of Kyuju and Judu and To Live, they all dealt with women at a different time in the history of China and their condition and whatnot. Even to a point, Shanghai Triad, not one of my favorites, but but Raise the Red Lantern is my very favorite of the bunch. It's my favorite film ever made. And Gong Li's performance in it, I mentioned earlier that Rene Falconetti in Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc is the greatest performance I've ever seen. But and I stand by that. But Gong Li's performance in Raise the Red Lantern is my favorite performance ever given by an actress. And Gong Li in general is my favorite actress who's ever lived. Her work with Yimou in particular is particularly great, but obviously some work with other filmmakers as well. I particularly love her, and recently did a rewatch of Farewell My Concubine, Chen Cage's beautiful 1993 film, Palme d'Or winner in 1993. And it is one of my favorite films. So, but this is the one that is very important to me, and I chose to highlight this as basically the last film of today's podcast because it's my favorite, and I figured I should save my favorite for last. So, yes, favorite film ever, and the most moving one, and some of the best imagery ever put to film, and the greatest use of architecture in the history of cinema as well. The framings and the compositions are incredible. And it's amazing the way that Yimou and his cinematographer and his art director managed to conjugate all these elements together to create images that are just absolutely sublime. There are some of the most exquisite images in the history of cinema, and I've never seen someone use architecture in that way to frame shots. It's just amazingly done. But most importantly, Gong Li is at the center, and she is, wow. You talk about a woman I love and an actress I love. She is very much it. That is pretty much about it for today. I'm sorry I didn't mention any female filmmakers. I feel bad about it. I had originally chosen a longer pile of films to highlight, but I didn't want this to last 5 fucking hours. So I chose to leave out a lot of films, and it wasn't planned on my part, but the way it turned out, all the ones that I left out, none of the ones that I had chosen initially that were directed by women ended up making the final cut, and I'm sorry about that. This is not to say that I don't like female filmmakers and female-made films. In fact, quite to the contrary, I've discovered something since 2017. I've been watching quite a lot of films that are directed by women, and interesting thing that I've noticed is the best films of the 2020s, so this current decade, for me, have been directed by women. When I made my list of the best films of 2022, for instance, 3 of my top 5 were directed by women, including my number 1. My number 1 of last year was directed by a woman. My number 1 of 2020 was directed by a woman. So it's not that female filmmakers don't figure in my thing. Trust me, they do, and they will get talked about eventually. I will talk about my best film of 2019 was also directed by a woman. I will be talking about female filmmakers. It's not that I chose to leave them out deliberately, it's just that they didn't happen to be the ones that really marked my life. And today's episode was about the films that truly had an impact on my personal life and on my personal journey as a cinephile. And it just so happens that no films directed by women are part of that journey, I'm very sorry to say. But in the 2020s now, the best films that I've seen and my favorite films that I've seen are almost all directed by women. So I'll be talking about female filmmakers, don't worry, that is not a problem. I don't want anyone to go thinking that I deliberately left out female filmmakers. I didn't deliberately leave out black or African filmmakers either. There will be some, don't worry about that. Recently I discovered Barry Jenkins' Underground Railroad, which is a TV series, but it's remarkable. There will be definitely stuff talking about everything. I want this to be broad. I've mentioned that already. So don't worry. There will be a lot of other stuff, and this is just the beginning. And this was a lot of fun for me. I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope everyone watching, even though this was very long and long-winded, and probably you're bored of hearing me speak by now, which is why I put some images in the back, even though they're repetitive. I hope I don't have problems with copyright, but I don't think so. I wanted to do a first introductory episode, and this is why this one is long. The next ones probably won't ever reach more than 45 minutes, so you shouldn't be too concerned about the other ones being too long and me just talking. The other ones will be a little bit more interactive. I'll be showing clips if I can, if Facebook doesn't, or YouTube doesn't forbid me from doing so. So keep that in mind, and I'm very sorry this one was very long, but it had to be because it was an introductory episode, and I had to introduce a lot of things and talk about myself, about my journey. So I had a lot of fun doing it. I hope you've had fun listening to this, and I'll see you very soon. Hopefully I do one of these every week. This is my plan. I've already selected my first film that I will be talking about. I'm not going to tell you what. I'll keep that as a surprise, but I can tell you it's one of the films that is in the pile that I chose today. So one of the films that I chose to highlight briefly today will be the subject of the first official podcast that is going to deal with one specific film. So when that happens, should be sometime next week. I work Thursdays through Sundays, so I will be recording anytime between Monday and Wednesday and posting it whenever it's done. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I'm looking forward to talking to you guys again, and I hope you've had fun, and I certainly did. And I will talk to you again very soon, and thank you very much for listening, everyone. Bye.